American irregulars coming out onto the field with a myriad of different uniforms, some representative of the regular army, others a little less so. Both sides employed lots of irregular troops over the course of the war, of a few different varieties. The most basic one that you would find were sedentary militia. Typically, these were citizens conscripted into either force during times of emergency as part of their citizenship. That meant that most of them weren't particularly well equipped or particularly well trained, meaning you found lots of different uniforms though. You also found that some units would be raised as volunteers. Over the course of the war, both in Canada and the United States, lots of regular citizens with wealthy backers most of the time came forward to offer their services and fight alongside the regular army in some way.
You can't get your gun off.
You can also see that our irregulars there have spaced themselves out, not the big, long, stiff lines that you generally would expect when fighting at the time, and there were a few different ways to do it. Whereas if you wanted to concentrate firepower in the open, having those shoulder-to-shoulder formations was very useful for light infantry like these irregulars. It's usually not the best idea. You're usually deployed as skirmishers. You're out there in loose formation, a harder target to hit, sniping at the enemy, skirmishing, harassing them, annoying them, and hopefully forcing them to move into a more advantageous position for you rather than for them. So often you find them getting close to the ground, using cover, and firing a bit more erratically to pepper the enemy with bullets. You might notice in the course of the battle as well that we'll have a few misfires on the field. Weapon pulls the trigger and nothing happens. That is entirely usual, especially for black powder weapons like this. The weapons themselves are very simple. It's a tube with a hole on either end with black powder and a bullet put down the barrel. But there are a lot of problems with the design because of the limitations they had. The firing mechanism, that big thing at the back near the trigger, is entirely exposed to the elements, and on a breezy day like today, that can be enough to drive the sparks you need to light the gunpowder away from it and make it pretty useless. The black powder itself also needs to be in good quantity, well placed, and dry. Luckily, it's a dry day today, but even on humid days, you can find that improperly stored gunpowder becomes sodden and unable to burn properly very quickly, which again means the weapon isn't going to get working very well. Even in perfect conditions, close to what we have today, about 20% of the time, the weapon will not properly fire, and that becomes worse and worse the more water or moisture you add to it. I'd also like to let people know on the southern side of our field, moving to get a better view, that if there isn't good room to view right now close to where the fighting is, the battle will be moving closer to the fort over the next 20 minutes. So you will eventually, if you can't find a good place farther north along the line, get a good position to watch the battle.
At that range, be bodies. Come on. Gotta be. Don't need the blood. Just see body count.
Now, not only did you have different kinds of soldiers from different places, you also had different kinds of weaponry out here. That simple tube I was talking about isn't the only weapon you would have found. And back there on the left side of the American line towards the trees, you can also see some men in blue frock coats with bright red or pink fringes. They're representing Kentucky rifles. those rifles themselves are much more accurate than the muskets. The ranges we can see here today are not entirely unrealistic for using muskets effectively, but the rifles had grooves inside the barrels. That grips the bullet and spins it as it goes towards the enemy, meaning that past 50 or 60 yards, you can accurately hit your target very well, and even do so at 2 or even 300 yards, well outside what a smoothbore musket would be effective at. The big trade-off there is that it's very expensive. Very few regular Army units were actually given rifles, and the Kentucky Rifles themselves largely brought them from their own homes on the Kentucky frontier. So, in that case, the American Army got rather lucky. You can also hear the men throwing a few insults at each other. That's also pretty historically accurate. If you were fighting, say, 50 or 60 yards away, that's within earshot, and we have plenty of written accounts of people insulting each other over distances like that, sometimes much smaller, mainly, I suppose, to pass the time and cut down on the anxiety of being in a life-or-death situation. Now, as the Battle of Chippewa itself began to commence early on the morning of July 5th of 1814, British light infantry quickly realized that there was American resistance coming up against them. And despite early hopes of success, American light infantry and regulars began to push out against them, particularly on the woods to the left side of that field, pushing them back eventually to the river. But eventually you found, as we can see here, that more regular troops in more standard shoulder-to-shoulder formations came out onto the field, and eventually, over the course of the battle, they would come to exchange those tightly packed close-range volleys of musket fire. And this was the point in the battle where American forces started to show the development they had over the past 2 years of the war. Earlier on, the British soldiers are found here, more often than not, had experience fighting in Europe. Many of their officers had formal training, whereas the American Army was more of a peacetime institution. Many of their soldiers had not had active combat duty, and many of their officers were career but hadn't had a lot of activity on the field, meaning the British Army, despite having fewer numbers, tended to come out on top in situations where it was a test of mettle between the soldiers. But after 2 years of near constant fighting, the American Army had learned its lesson. Most of the officers out here at the Battle of Chippewa were much better experienced. They were younger, a new generation of formally educated men, some of whom came from West Point Military Academy, making them quite fearsome to face, and they knew how to organize and train their soldiers. They'd actually organized training camps in upstate New York specifically for this invasion, and at Chippewa it showed. As the British moved towards them, firing volleys, they found that they could not break them, even under cannon fire, and despite the fact that they attempted to charge with bayonets to break the American line, they found the American line simply bowed to accommodate them and fired disciplined volley after disciplined volley into them, meaning the British, after multiple attempts, were not able to close with them. That was the heaviness of the firepower coming towards them. This campaign, in many ways, was a watershed moment for the U.S. Army, demonstrating both to the British and people back home that they were firmly capable of standing up against what was reputed to be the greatest army in the world on an open field in the way the enemy would prefer to fight. So this battle was quite important for the American Army.
I don't know who this guy is. And there's 2 kids. He's got 2 kids with him. He had to be one of the big shots.
We got 2 Americans dead. The British refused to lie down.
Look at this troop thing behind. And behind the flying troop. Look at the other troops marching in. like they did in Spain, praying backwards with the flags.
And here we can see the main line of the British force marching out to meet the Americans. Many of the British soldiers who found at this battle weren't just experienced soldiers, but some of the regiments that had been coming down in 1813 and 14 were Napoleonic veterans, many of whom had spent the past few years fighting in places like Portugal, Spain, and the Mediterranean against the French Empire during the 20-odd-year-long series of wars against France. That meant that they had a lot of experience, and this is one of the ways that we know how the U.S. Army was developing, because we have written accounts from them stating just how impressed they were with both the discipline and the happiness of fire coming from the American line, which, after fighting against the Grand Army, was no small praise. And that's what a good disciplined volley sounds like.
There's one down on the ground.
Yeah, there's a volley. Oh, got three of them. He's still moving.
The white flag would be a battalion flag.
Yes. Oh, there is the Union Jack.
Yeah.
As the Battle of Chippewa wore on, the superiority of American firepower and arriving reinforcements started to make it clear to the British that they would not be able to hold the field, and they began to pull back towards the Chippewa River and the safety of Fort Chippewa. If you're wondering where Fort Chippewa is, it's currently a park, Kingsbridge Park in Chippewa, Ontario. No longer exists, but that is the exact location of the place. They retreated back there across the bridge to safety, and despite the fact that Seneca and Tuscarora warriors fighting with the U.S. Army pursued them to the water, no one dared pursue them beyond. And the next day, after an attempt to basically surround them by the American Army, British retreated yet further away from the field at Chippewa towards Fort George, and the Americans followed suit. The Americans would then attempt to lay siege to Fort George, but this did not go according to plan. The main reason for this is that the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy did not have a unified command structure, and the commander of the American fleet on Lake Ontario was not eager to join in the festivities. He was building new warships and had become rather sick in July and did not want to bring them out too early. So because of that, the U.S. Army couldn't get the heavy siege guns they needed to lay siege to the walls, and eventually, as British reinforcements began to come down from modern-day Toronto, they realized that they needed to begin pulling back, lighting fire to the town of St. David's and destroying other civilian property to help cover their retreat as they moved south of Niagara Falls.
Oh, yeah. Start with 1,000 on each side, like they'll have 1,000 out there.
There's another troop coming behind this line. I just got off there. Going to the other guy.
You can see here as well we have walking wounded being brought off of the field. That was often the case in battles like this. The medical establishment of both armies was a little more simplistic than you tend to find today, and more often than not, if you were wounded in line and no longer capable of fighting with the rest of the unit, you would simply fall back behind, or if you weren't capable, musicians from your unit would come forward and drag you out forcibly, more or less to make room for the people who wanted to move up to provide the fire that the army was looking for. Past that, there wasn't a lot of immediate medical attention available on the field in these situations. Many of the men would have had to wait for hours to be seen by a trained medical professional, usually a surgeon who went through some kind of apprenticeship process behind the lines, meaning that there was a very long time where the wounds could become worse, could become dirty, and could become infected. And most of the time, if you suffered a bullet wound to a limb, a leg, or an arm, you're probably going to lose it unless you get very, very lucky. Those amputations tended to be successful in most cases, but after battles like this, and especially Lundy's Lane, which became even more bloody, you found that many of these surgeons had to deal with dozens, if not hundreds, of amputations and other operations over the course of days after the battle, just to accommodate all of the volume they had to deal with.
The Americans are supposed to be pushed out.
As the Americans retreated south of Niagara Falls away from Fort George, the British quickly pursued them in force, keeping contact to make sure that the force did not slip away and evade their notice. That meant that a large force of over 1,000 soldiers pursued them down into what is today downtown Niagara Falls, and as the Americans made camp on the field of Chippewa, they made camp north of it at what is today Lundy's Lane, named after a farmer who owned land there at the time. They took up a position on the heights, a good domineering position from which they could keep an eye on the Americans and make sure they were in good position in case of trouble. The Americans, however, were not content to sit by and allow the momentum to be lost during the campaign, so eventually they started making moves north to try and scare the British, force them out of their position back towards Fort George. Unfortunately for the Americans, they did not fully realize the extent of the British forces on Lundy's Lane Heights and ended up engaging them on July 25th of 1814. This meant that they started a battle without particularly meaning to, which quickly grew out of their control. Thousands of soldiers on both sides were brought up as reinforcements over the next 5 or 6 hours of fighting, which extended into the night past dark. That was not usual, because at that point, without modern technology or floodlamps, you're not going to be able to see much, and one of the hallmarks of the Battle of Lundy's Lane was just how confusing, muddled, and bloody it became towards the end because of that lack of visibility. As the battle continued and both sides continued to bring reinforcements up from their respective camps, it became a slugging match very quickly, and both sides attacked and counterattacked to try and take control of strategic positions along the ridge, and one of them was an artillery position near a cemetery on the ridge itself near the center of the British line. This became the scene of multiple hand-to-hand engagements over the course of the battle, as the British attempt to keep control of the position, and the Americans charged with bayonets, taking the guns on more than one occasion. This is one of the reasons why fighting after dark was a bad idea, because as the position switched back and forth over the course of the battle, many people on both sides couldn't always be sure of who was there. We have one story written down in an account of a man bringing up ammunition for the British guns, only to realize after supplying them with the ammunition that they were in fact American gunners who had taken control of the position in the time he'd been away running for the ammunition. And this would also find a lot of friendly fire incidents over the course of the battle, as the gunpowder began to hang low in the air and it became darker and darker. Identifying people without modern communications technology became incredibly difficult at any reasonable distance. In fact, the president of the U.S. Army, dressed in gray, very much like the smoke they were moving through, made a somewhat unlicensed movement around the flank of the British force, attempting to draw their flank and push them inward, but they ended up getting lost in the darkness and smoke and spent about 20 minutes marching between both battle lines, stuck between American and British forces, none of whom knew who they are, and both of whom fired upon them until they could get some kind of recognizable identification from them. So again, identification and visibility were very important parts of 19th century battlefields, and this is part of the reason why British soldiers tended to wear those bright red coats with white pants, the tall shiny hats, and those shoot me here X's in the middle of their chests. It might seem ridiculous today, but at the time it was communication, a big safety vest to make sure your friends knew not to shoot you in a pinch, whether close up or far away.
There'd be much coolness in laying on the grass.
Yeah, in the hot sun.
We can also see, as kids are moving around the field, there are different kinds of uniforms in the units, and some of them really stand out. Most of them are your standard musket sluggers, wearing those nice wool coats and pants, and carrying around the standard issue muskets most of them were given. But you can also see some men in much prettier uniforms, finer materials, big plumage in their hats, and swords across their waists. Those are the officers commanding the soldiers, and they tended to come from a different social class. Most of the regular soldiers you find out here came from the working classes, often from the large cities of Britain and the United States. People who didn't have access to land, did not have ways to save money, and often struggled to just find food on a daily basis. So many of them were probably in this horrible situation simply because they were trying to avoid starvation back home. As for the officers, they tended to come from the upper classes. Most of them were gentlemen by the strict definition of the term, members of the gentry, people who came from social and financial privilege comparative to most of the soldiers. But it's also somewhat a miscommunication to say that they were always behind the lines, safely away from the fighting, because that's just not how fighting in the 19th century happened. Because of a lack of communications technology, junior officers especially, most of the officers out here today are represented representing junior officers would have been forefront with the soldiers to guide them, lead them, and get an idea of what was happening on these confusing fields. That's rather important, and it means that in the British Army particularly, rates of casualties of junior officers were often significantly higher than the regular soldiers they were leading because they were dressed up like peacocks and were very obvious targets in the middle of a firing line. The officers are coming forward to parley, end the fighting, exchange prisoners, and hopefully part on better terms than they came to. And here, folks, we have our fife and drum groups coming out to play a lament to honor the soldiers that fell on these battlefields, whose actions we're reenacting today. And if you folks wouldn't mind a moment of silence to doff your caps to honor these soldiers with the reenactors on the field. A round of applause for our fife and drum and other volunteers. They've done a wonderful job. Now Now, with that, folks, that concludes our battle for this afternoon, but that is not the end of the day nor the weekend. This was just the first of our two major battles today. Our final one of the day and the biggest one of the weekend will be our night assault reenactment. That's tonight at 8 o'clock on the same field. It's free, just like this battle as well. Come out, we'll have all of our reenactors on the field, and we will blow up a small portion of our site for your enjoyment. Afterwards, we will also have one of the highlights of our annual programming, our lantern tours. You'll find us, the staff, and our reenacting volunteers inside the fort acting in person, a series of vignettes to give you a feel of the site under siege with gunfire around, tour guides taking you from place to place. It's one of the best things we put on over the course of the year, and admission for that can be bought in the Welcome Center after the night battle. Before you go as well, I'd also like to thank our sponsors here as well, who make all of this possible along with you and our volunteers. Turks for Lumber providing all the wood we need for both our siege ladders to get our British soldiers inside so we can blow up the fort, as well as for the pyrotechnics so that we can do the blowing up. Secondly, we also have McDonald's to thank. Feeding all the people we have here, spending their precious time helping us, is rather expensive, so having sausages, pancakes, and drinks for them has been quite a bonus. And of course, we'd like to